If you want to understand how money, power, and global politics really work, then make sure to subscribe to Capital Explained, because today's story is not just about oil or war. It's about a system that has quietly controlled the world economy for decades and what happens if it starts to break. March 15, 2026 marked a historic moment when oil aboard a Pakistani owned tanker named Karachi passed safely through the Strait of Hormuz. What made this event significant was that the transaction was conducted not in US dollars but in Chinese yuan. On the same day, another vessel also transported crude oil along a yuan based trade route. This development challenges a long standing system that has supported the foundation of the United States economy, the petrodollar arrangement. Under this agreement, Gulf states agreed to sell oil in US dollars in exchange for American military protection and support. However, what was meant to secure American dominance has, over time, given a small group of nations considerable influence over the world's most powerful country. Recently, tensions in the region have escalated sharply. Following US and Israeli strikes that reportedly eliminated Iran's supreme leader, a wave of retaliatory attacks spread across the region. The Gulf states, which had maintained stability for decades under their agreement with the US, now find themselves in an increasingly uncertain situation. For nearly 50 years, this arrangement has held steady, but today, the very countries supporting the system are beginning to question its future. If these nations decide to move away from this framework, the consequences may not be immediate, but rather a gradual weakening, one that could potentially impact America's global dominance over time. To understand how a handful of desert nations gain such strategic leverage, it is important to look at their transformation. In the early 20th century, these regions were largely undeveloped. That changed with the discovery of oil, beginning in Bahrain in 1932. Within a few decades, the entire Gulf region became a major oil producer. By the 1990s, oil revenues had completely reshaped these societies. What were once sparsely populated desert settlements evolved into modern cities. Dubai, for example, transformed from a small trading port into a global metropolis filled with skyscrapers in just a generation. This economic growth also influenced governance. Oil wealth was controlled by the state, allowing governments to fund infrastructure, provide subsidies, and maintain stability. In return, citizens accepted limited political participation, forming a unique social contract. However, this system depends on two critical conditions: continuous revenue from oil and regional stability. Recognizing this, Gulf countries have made significant efforts in recent years to diversify their economies. Saudi Arabia has invested heavily in tourism and entertainment. The UAE has positioned itself as a global hub for finance and innovation, and Qatar gained international attention by hosting the World Cup. Today, tourism contributes around 12% to the GDP of both Saudi Arabia and the UAE. Dubai International Airport ranks among the busiest in the world for international travel. Additionally, the region's sovereign wealth funds manage trillions of dollars in global assets, including major investments in the United States. Despite these advancements, the entire system still relies on one key factor: the perception of stability and safety for global investors. However, recent events have shaken that perception. Following military actions involving the US and Israel against Iran, retaliatory missile strikes targeted both civilian and military sites across Gulf nations. In just a few weeks, decades of carefully built trust and stability have come under serious strain. The world's largest oil refinery was forced to shut down. At the same time, the biggest gas processing facility also came to a halt. Together, these disruptions have already reduced supply by nearly 6.7 million barrels per day. At current market prices, that translates to losses of roughly $1 billion every single day. It is important to understand that most Gulf nations are not democracies. There are no elections through which public frustration can be redirected or managed. Their entire system relies on a social contract. Governments must ensure steady income and maintain internal security. If either of these pillars weakens, the stability of the regime itself comes under threat. However, these countries are far from powerless. Over the past 5 decades, they have strategically positioned themselves as a critical foundation of the global economy. If they begin to view the United States as a threat to their survival, they possess significant leverage to respond. Collectively, these nations account for nearly one-third of the world's oil production, with Saudi Arabia contributing the largest share. Even more crucially, they hold over half of the world's proven oil reserves. This means that global oil prices are heavily influenced by the decisions these countries make. If they were to threaten a sustained cut in production unless the United States changed its course, energy prices worldwide could surge dramatically. Such a spike would likely put immense pressure on Washington, potentially forcing it to reconsider its actions or, at the very least, avoid a prolonged conflict. Political leadership in the United States has historically been sensitive to market performance. Economic indicators often play a key role in shaping public perception. A sudden rise in energy prices, especially close to important elections, could create serious political challenges for any administration that has promised to keep costs low. While this scenario may sound extreme, history shows that similar events have occurred before. In 1973, during the Yom Kippur War, oil-producing nations in the Middle East, led by Saudi Arabia, cut off oil supplies to countries supporting Israel. This decision disrupted the steady flow of crude oil to Western economies, causing prices to jump from around $3 to $10 per barrel within a few months. The result was a prolonged period of economic difficulty, including high inflation across Western nations. In the United States, inflation eventually rose above 13%. Under such pressure, American policy began to shift, leading to diplomatic efforts that helped bring the conflict to an end. Despite this historical precedent, today's global landscape is quite different. The United States is no longer as dependent on Gulf oil as it once was. Before the 1970s crisis, about one-third of its oil imports came from the region. Today, that figure is closer to 10%. Additionally, the US has become one of the world's largest oil producers and even exports energy to other countries. At first glance, this might suggest that the Gulf's influence has declined. In reality, their power has evolved rather than diminished. While the United States often demonstrates its strength through military force, its greatest advantage lies in the global dominance of its currency, the US dollar. The dollar functions as the world's primary reserve currency. In the past, currencies were backed by tangible assets like gold or silver. Today, many are effectively supported by dollar reserves, which make up around 60% of global foreign exchange holdings. For countries to maintain confidence in their own currencies, they often rely on holding US dollars. This leads to an important question: what gives the dollar its value? While factors like America's economy, technology, and military strength play a role, a significant part of its dominance stems from a long-standing arrangement with Gulf nations. This agreement established what is now known as the Petrodollar system. This kind of economic structure has appeared throughout history. In the 19th century, Britain stood as the world's leading superpower, controlling vast territories and a large share of the global economy. International trade largely revolved around the British Empire, with goods flowing through its ports from regions like India, China, and Southeast Asia. When a country becomes the center of global trade, its currency gains widespread demand, not necessarily because people prefer it, but because it becomes a common medium for international transactions. This creates a powerful advantage: the ability to borrow large amounts of money without facing the usual economic consequences. Much of that money is absorbed globally rather than causing immediate domestic inflation. The United States enjoys a similar benefit today. Despite issuing large amounts of currency, the dollar remains dominant because the rest of the world continues to rely on it. However, this system depends entirely on trust. If global confidence in the dollar begins to weaken, the entire structure that supports it could start to unravel. For Britain, global demand for its currency was driven by trade, spices, cotton, and raw materials flowing through its empire. But as that empire declined, the need for the British pound also faded, and the system built around it eventually weakened. For the United States, that global demand is largely tied to one critical resource: oil. Ensuring continuous demand for the dollar is exactly why the Gulf states have become so strategically important to America. A small group of these nations controls nearly 30% of the world's oil supply, and at present, that supply is under serious threat. The entire Gulf region has effectively turned into a conflict zone, forcing major reductions in oil production. At the same time, the Strait of Hormuz, a vital route through which nearly one-fifth of the world's oil passes, has been severely disrupted. Around 150 ships have been left stranded, many of which typically transport close to 2 million barrels of oil per journey. These vessels have become easy targets, and Iran has not hesitated to exploit that vulnerability. It's important to remember that oil is not just about fuel for vehicles. It is deeply embedded in modern life. It supports agriculture through fertilizers and is used in manufacturing plastics that package countless everyday products. The United States understood this long ago. By linking its currency to a resource that every country needs, it could ensure constant global demand for dollars. Following the 1973 oil crisis, the administration of President Richard Nixon quietly initiated negotiations with Saudi Arabia, then the world's most influential oil producer. By 1975, an agreement was reached that would reshape the global economy for decades. The core idea was simple: oil transactions would be conducted exclusively in US dollars. This changed how global trade functioned. For example, if a country like South Korea wanted to purchase oil from the United Arab Emirates, it couldn't simply use its own currency. Instead, it first had to exchange its currency for US dollars, and only then complete the transaction. In this way, the dollar became the central medium, even in deals where the United States was not directly involved. When multiplied across the entire world, the scale of this system becomes massive. The global oil market is worth around $3.7 trillion annually, roughly 3% of global GDP. About 90% of this trade occurs outside the United States, yet it still relies on dollars. This creates a constant flow of US currency circulating globally, driven purely by the need for energy. This system has given the United States a powerful advantage. It allows the country to import vast amounts of goods without needing to send equivalent value in return. Instead, it issues financial assets like treasury bonds backed by a currency it can produce. Since other countries need dollars for oil purchases, they are willing to accept this arrangement. As a result, the United States has run a trade deficit every year since 1976. For nearly 5 decades, it has imported more than it has exported. In 2025 alone, that deficit reached $900 billion. Over time, this has led to a total external debt of about $26 trillion, goods and services effectively paid for through dollar-based financial instruments. For ordinary Americans, this system has acted like a hidden economic benefit, adding roughly $3,000 per person each year in value. It has helped sustain a high standard of living while also supporting the largest military infrastructure in history. However, this advantage comes with a risk. It gives Gulf nations significant influence. If these countries ever decided to sell oil in another currency, such as the Chinese yuan or even gold, the global demand supporting the dollar could weaken sharply. Right now, that possibility is beginning to feel more realistic than ever. Some Gulf nations have already started reconsidering their investments in the United States, even after previously committing massive sums. Frustration is becoming visible. In one instance, a Dubai-based billionaire publicly questioned why the region should bear the consequences of a conflict it did not seek, before later deleting the statement. These are among America's closest allies, yet tensions are rising. The original reason these countries supported the petrodollar system was because the United States offered something equally valuable in return: security. But increasingly, there are doubts about whether that promise is being fulfilled. For example, Gulf nations had little interest in escalating tensions with Iran. In fact, just days before conflict began, officials were sent to Washington in an attempt to prevent it, efforts that went largely ignored. Since then, concerns have only grown. Reports suggested that Qatar's stockpile of missile defense systems could be depleted within days, yet additional support was not provided. This is not an isolated incident. In 2019, attacks on Saudi oil facilities temporarily disrupted about 5% of global supply. Despite requests for support, the US response was limited. Incidents like this have raised questions about the reliability of long standing security guarantees. Even so, moving away from the dollar is not simple. The global oil market has been structured around it for nearly 50 years. A sudden shift to another currency would create complications for buyers, forcing adjustments that could lead to lower prices for sellers. As a result, even if many countries are dissatisfied, few are willing to make the first move. That hesitation may change if a strong alternative emerges. Gulf nations do not just need a currency, they need a powerful partner capable of ensuring their security in a volatile region. For decades, that role was played by the United States. Today, however, the global balance is shifting. China's role in global trade has expanded rapidly over the past 2 decades. It now accounts for around 14% of global exports, and its military presence has grown significantly. In response, Gulf countries have begun gradually strengthening ties with Beijing. China is already Saudi Arabia's largest trading partner. The two nations have also established agreements allowing trade to be settled in their own currencies, bypassing the US dollar entirely. Unlike the United States, China does not impose political conditions, does not pressure them on internal matters, and offers advanced technology and defense cooperation without the same level of restrictions. All of this suggests a slow but meaningful shift in global dynamics, one that could reshape the balance of economic power in the years ahead. None of these developments alone is enough to break the system, but each one slowly weakens the belief that the US dollar is the only dominant global currency. Going back to the original petrodollar agreement of the 1970s, the deal was straightforward. Saudi Arabia would sell its oil exclusively in US dollars, and in return, the United States would provide military protection and security guarantees. However, an important question remained: what would the Gulf states do with the vast amounts of dollars they earned from oil sales? For years, this remained unclear. It was only in 2016 that the reality became public. The funds were largely reinvested back into US financial markets. In simple terms, money used by countries around the world to buy oil eventually flowed back into the American economy. The scale of this recycling was massive. By 1977, Saudi Arabia alone held around 20% of all US debt owned by foreign governments. When official figures were revealed decades later, Saudi holdings were reported at approximately $117 billion. For the United States, this inflow of capital is extremely important. The government consistently spends more than it earns and covers this gap by issuing treasury bonds. These are essentially loans taken from investors who are promised repayment with interest. The greater the demand for these bonds, the lower the interest rates the US has to offer. Conversely, if fewer investors are willing to lend, interest rates must rise to attract them. Over decades of borrowing, the US has accumulated an enormous national debt, now approaching $39 trillion. Servicing this debt already costs over $1 trillion annually in interest payments, making it the largest single expense in the federal budget. On average, this equates to roughly $3,000 per American each year. If demand for US debt were to decline, for example, if key international investors pulled back, the cost would rise sharply. Even a 2% increase in interest rates could add around $700 billion annually to the government's expenses. This would force difficult decisions, cutting major portions of government spending, raising taxes significantly, or borrowing even more just to pay existing interest obligations. This is one of the key reasons the Gulf states hold considerable short term influence over the United States. However, any major shift is unlikely to happen suddenly. The global financial system is vast and deeply interconnected, making a rapid collapse unlikely. Instead, such systems tend to weaken gradually as countries begin diversifying and reducing dependence over time. That process has already begun. Saudi Arabia's Public Investment Fund has started allocating significant capital into Asian markets. Gulf sovereign wealth funds, which collectively manage over $3 trillion, are quietly reducing their exposure to US assets. At the same time, Saudi Arabia is strengthening its defense ties with China. These changes may not attract as much attention as dramatic events like oil embargoes, but they represent a steady and meaningful shift. It is less about a sudden break and more about a slow rebalancing of global power. Interestingly, policies focused on prioritizing national interests could have unintended consequences. While it may seem beneficial in the short term to act independently, distancing allies often comes at a cost. For the United States, that cost could eventually impact the dominance of the dollar-based system. At the same time, new economic pressures are emerging. Plans to significantly increase the US military budget, potentially reaching $1.5 trillion, along with rapidly growing electricity demand driven by artificial intelligence, are placing additional strain on resources. Experts have warned of a potential copper shortage, with demand expected to surge dramatically in the coming decades. Copper is becoming a critical resource, essential for energy systems, infrastructure, and advanced technologies. With demand projected to rise sharply by 2040, supply constraints could create major challenges. The United States and China are increasingly competing over access to such key materials, highlighting a broader shift in global economic dynamics. In response, efforts are being made to strengthen domestic production. Policies aimed at boosting local mining and reducing reliance on imports are gaining momentum. The focus on securing mineral supply chains reflects a larger strategic shift as countries seek to protect their long-term economic and technological interests. Overall, these developments point toward a gradual transformation rather than an abrupt change, one where financial systems, global alliances, and resource dependencies are all slowly evolving.